This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, I get to talk with Dr. Scot Brown, Associate Professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Brown is the author of the book Fighting for Us, in addition to numerous articles. He is the contributing author and editor of the book Discourse on Africana Studies, James Turner and Paradigms of Knowledge. As a musician, songwriter, and producer, Dr. Brown also looks at the role of African American music and popular culture. He has appeared on many programs in television, radio, and social media, including NPR, TV1, VH1, BET Centric, Sirius XM Radio, and KLARU. He is a musician and producer, in addition to being a scholar. So it is a great pleasure to have Dr. Brown with us here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to have this conversation.
Sure. It's a pleasure.
So to get started, what got you into the field of Black studies?
My whole journey in the academic work, I kind of stumbled into. So I was planning on being a full-time musician when I was younger. When I went to college, went to community college, and then I went to undergrad and for the 4-year degree. And my plan was mainly to teach high school. So I taught high school for a couple of years. And actually, after the first year of teaching high school, I was told about a program. I was very interested in Afrocentric writings, Afrocentric teachings at the time. I was listening to the works of John Henrik Clarke, Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Ben. So I heard that there was a program not far from where I was teaching high school in Rochester, New York, at Cornell University, and it was Africana Studies and Research Center. I had also listened to lectures by Dr. James Turner, and he talked about race, and he talked about race in terms of its structural presence in society, as opposed to talking about it as racial prejudice and set of attitudes. And those were lectures that he was doing at community-based centers in New York City. And I was also reading works by Frances Cress Welsing, the ISIS Papers. I was reading a lot of Afrocentric material. My mentor locally was named Gerald Shaka, and he was a former member of a group called US, the US organization, and he owned a bookstore called Kitabu Kingdom. All that together led me to this program at Cornell University in Africana Studies, where I heard that Dr. Ben and Dr. Clarke had previously taught there. So I was really excited about it, and I drove up there, and I applied, and I got in. I studied African languages over the summer there, West African language, Mandinka, and then when I got there, I studied Kiswahili, but my specialty was more of a historical project. But I was within African American studies, Africana studies, and I had a great experience of interfacing with scholars from all over the Black world. That was really my launch pad into Africana Black studies.
So what keeps you in the field?
I'm sorry?
What keeps you committed to the field and to this work?
Well, my commitment grows out of the interest in linking scholarship to the real world conditions that African Americans and the Black world face. I also like the way Black studies talks across geographies, that you meet and interface with students and scholars from all over the world. And you start to think about relationships between and within these Black populations, and you start finding symmetries and commonalities as well as differences as you grow into more of a global perspective on the Black world. So I really enjoy that activist dimension because you find that so much of intellectual work is appreciated and embraced by large segments of our community, many of whom, don't are working class people, but they're still very excited and interested in the kind of research that we do in Black history, in Black music, Black scholarship. And so that is a big push away from the more elitist model that the American Academy is grounded in. And so when the Black Studies movement opened those doors, by the time that I start getting into Black Studies in the 90s, we have scholars that were the pioneers of that movement that are now in faculty positions. And so that opportunity for intergenerational connection, feel like you have a mission. So many people in life wonder, why am I doing this? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Well, you don't have really a moment to ask that question because the answer is very clear when you think about what we do and why we do it.
Thank you. That was a really great response and caused me to think about a number of things, especially when we think about how we go from a valuing of knowledge in the public arena and a valuing of this intellectual project that has very real world implications to the academy itself and the ways in which we move and do research and exist within those spaces. So I wanted to ask you how you situate yourself both in relation to the disciplines, so like the discipline of history, in relationship to the work that you do in African American studies, but also because you are a musician, right? How do you think about the linkages between your work as a musician and your work in African American studies, both in the academy and in the community?
Well, that's one thing that's really powerful about African American studies as a discipline is that it has such elasticity. There's so much in the way of need in our community for empowerment in areas of culture, in areas of solidifying our versions of history, of the past, in the way of empowering, Black creativity, Black ownership. All of these areas are areas of need for growth and expansion. So that allows you to move from one aspect to the other. When I finished my master's degree in Africana Studies after having worked with Dr. James Turner, Robert Harris, who's a historian in Africana Studies, who was my dissertation chair. So I came back after teaching, interestingly, in Laurel. I taught in high school or second year in Laurel after having my master's, and I went running on back to getting my doctorate. I just, didn't have it. So I went and I worked in the history department because there was really only in 93 one PhD program that had a lot of students. It was a very exciting program. It was at Temple University. We were all very excited about it, but there was just so many people there. And I got the opportunity to get the PhD in history and still work with one of my mentors, Professor Harris, who was in Africana Studies. Sort of the best of both worlds from that perspective. So I came back in 1994, and I still never separated myself from Africana Studies. So the two were very interrelated in the sense that I learned the methodologies of history, which are very important tools in terms of representing the past, tools to create a narrative about the past. But I also remained very much tied to the intellectual mission and also the interdisciplinarity
Mm-hmm.
of Africana studies the whole time through. And so that's what allowed me to be, I guess the young people say double fisted, right? They go out to the party to have something in one hand and something in the other. And I think I approached the academy similarly.
How do you think about your work as a musician in relationship to Black studies?
Well, it's funny because I grew up wanting, my hometown, Rochester, New York, is 1 hour from Buffalo. And Buffalo is where Rick James is from. So Rick James was my hero, okay? In fact, I met Prince in 1980 when I was 14 years old, and he was the opening act for Rick James. All right. I was like, man, where's Rick James? Growing up, I was up at the Holiday Inn looking to meet up with Rick James, Slick Rick, we call it. I think I had a demo tape and everything from my band, you know. And Rick James wasn't there, and the guy says, well, there goes that guy Prince who's opening up for him. And I was like, I got his autograph. He kind of was real quiet and a little bit aloof. And I was like, man, he got an attitude. He ain't Rick James. You know? So my band broke up just before I started taking classes. Or less, they didn't break up. I left the band and then I started taking classes. Group was called Radiance. And so I ended up playing, but putting it to the side. I'm a bassist, bass guitarist, and songwriter. The irony is I got back into music in part through my research. So the group that I wrote my first book on was my dissertation project called the US Organization. And remember, I mentioned my mentor, Gerald Shaka, owned that bookstore. And I promised him that I would write a book on that group because there was nothing really written about the group. You saw them show up as foils or the villains in a struggle with the Black Panther Party, or you saw them represented as being especially sexist in their perspectives, but you didn't really know anything about the group. And I was surprised that there was very little done there. So I got into doing research on that study. And somewhere in there, I was reading documents that were written that would say this booklet was written by James Mtume and another person, Halisi. And I was like, Mtume. Then I started interviewing people, and it was like, oh, yeah, James Mtume, the person who wrote The Closer I Get to You and Juicy and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I said, yeah, he was in the US Organization. I said, really? It just didn't add up. But that was an artist that I played his songs. My band Radiance, the band I was in, I should say, Radiance, we played Juicy, and we played another song by Mtume called Would You Like to Fool Around? We played those songs in our show. So it was very, very interesting in that I found some archival footage of Mtume with the US Organization playing with their dance troupe. And at that time, it's in the 90s. I would say late 90s. I contacted him. I think I called. He was scoring the music. You ever watch New York Undercover back in the day or reruns of it?
Mm-hmm.
You know when the musicians go and perform in this club and they sing? Well, that was all re-recorded in Mtume's studio in his basement. So somehow I got his information from New York Undercover, and I left a message, Mr. Mtume, I have some footage of you. I think you might be interested in. And so I just, a long shot, you're a grad student. I hang up 5 minutes later. Hey, this is Mtume. Well, you say you got some footage, and we were good friends ever since until he passed on. He was really another kind of mentor of mine. But one point that he made to get you right into your question, Mtume was a very interesting person because he was an activist, he was a scholarly commentator, intellectual, political commentator, and he was a musician and producer. And he said to me, the highest form of art is intellect, and the highest form of intellect is art. Don't separate the two. And that was very rewarding to me. The other thing he said that I think I mentioned to him, or he picked up that I played. And he said, well, why are you not playing? I said, well, I'm doing the scholarly thing now. He said, well, that's a mistake because your scholarship and life in general is like warfare. You're in battle. And music and playing music gives you some place to go. And most people spend their lives trying to find some place to go. And you already have it. So you're not utilizing all. And I started writing again. So the end of the book, Fighting for Us, I actually rearranged the chapter, rearranged the organization of the book. The last chapter of that book is the Us organization and the arts of war, because I wanted to end on this artistic note, as opposed to, things fall apart kind of thing. And so that's how I started to merge the two. I started recording again. I did the music and collaborative work with Kalamu Yasalam. He's a poet, veteran Black arts poet. I did that album on him called Catfish and Yellow Grits. That's out. We recorded that. And then I started putting out my own singles. And I see them as very much tied to Black studies in a sense that when you think about Black art, visual arts, the arts of the body, like dance and sports, music, you look at what we think about as these unequal relationships with respect to ownership and power, yet we're producing it. And there's a music executive, Dick Griffey, who owns Solar Records, who said, Black music is to Black people as what oil and diamonds are to the African continent in terms of the resource. So we have this resource that's not nationalized. It makes everybody else wealthy except for the people that produce it, right? That became a neat way to talk about culture from a standpoint of political economy, which is really the direction I'm going in when I deal with culture, art, Black creativity from a Black studies perspective.
Thank you. That was super interesting to hear about that trajectory and the way that you were able to meet and interact with so many amazing artists and scholars. But also, I think that the point about the role of arts in the wars that are being fought in African American studies, in the African American experience, I think is really important, especially right now, to think about, right? And the ways that the arts are so important with that. And in the sustaining power of the arts. So that's really, now you've got me thinking of all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and you think about the reason why there's so much difficulty in the world appreciating Black oppression and the oppression of Black people is because we are so prominent culturally. Mm-hmm. I remember I had a student from Eastern Europe in one of my classes. This is right around the time of when Obama was running for president in 2007. The campaign was still going. And he said, you have a Black candidate for president. You have all these famous people. Why are Black people so upset? And I said, you have to make a distinction between prominence, and power. There's a huge gap. In fact, I would argue that that's probably one of the last things the United States sells to the world is Black culture, right? Through sports, through music, through celebrity, and all these other things, through style, right? And so that's where I get into these kinds of things. There's another song that if you would be interested in playing or listening to, it's by a rapper named Ohene Savant, OHENE SAVANT. And his album, it's the title track of his album, is called The Salt. And at the end of the song, I kind of do some It's me talking about this being the salt of the earth, and I'm talking about salt, really the double entendre being salt of the earth, not just in terms of being something, a group of people that are so grounded and humble, but also salt as a resource that was very much valued in the heyday of the Malian Empire and the Empire of Ghana, right? You traded salt for gold. So that wealth that we have that sustains the world is also one of the big contradictions with especially Black folks in the diaspora, but on the continent as well. But they actually have natural resources there on the continent where the people are the predominant resource in the diaspora. And our culture, our labor, etc.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned trying to explain that to a student from Eastern Europe who might not necessarily have the same context and understanding about Black people and the difference between prominence and power. I personally am super interested in what we do in classrooms, particularly in Black studies classrooms, and when we're talking about not just courses that incorporate Black people, but like actual Black studies type courses that are rooted in the community. And so I'm very interested in how your work and your musicianship informs your teaching.
Yeah, it came out in the classroom. Now, that student, that was not an overnight transformation. The student said by the end of the class, like, now I understand it. But he had to go through all of these scenarios where people's prominence falls short of protecting them from being marginalized in various situations. They had to understand the problem of the gross inequality in this society where, more than a third or so of our population are in poverty, right? We have this is not the best analogy from a standpoint of precision, but about a third of us are doing really well. Another third of us are, getting by. Maybe you have one of the few remaining high wage working class jobs, or maybe you work, in municipal or federal government, things of that sort. You're paying your bills, you got a little something. And then there's the other third of us that are in really, really dire straits. And the Black experience is such that the class divisions are not that profound in the sense that our families usually, outside of our nuclear families, include people from all three of those. Well, maybe not the ones that are doing really well, but you definitely are tied to folks who are struggling, right? And sometimes it's within our nuclear family. So I'm always interested in showing and talking about these things with students from a standpoint of pulling out. I've been lucky to have mostly Black students at UCLA because African American studies is that magnet. But there are other people as well. But I'm, like the Eastern European student. So there's also the encounter, not just with me, but it's also the encounter with others that can talk about life experiences. Also trying to, at UCLA, the big challenge is also getting students away from Westwood, the area where UCLA is, and into, let's say, a place like what they call now Africa Town, Lamert Park, taking them to institutions or having them have direct encounters with people. I think that's where you start to get the nuance, the kind of nuance that defies overly emphasizing prominence, as opposed to power and the dynamics behind the prominence that you'll see. So, if you take from a prominent person like LeBron James, But then you get behind it, right? You look at Cleveland, you look at the Black community in Cleveland, you look at the tremendous cultural capital
Mm-hmm.
and all of the urban challenges that come with it. And so I think that the hardest part for most, both in this society and possibly even abroad, is just grappling with the principle of contradiction. That something can look and have all the characteristics of one aspect of what you think constitutes power and have very little of the real substance at the same time. And it's really hard for people to kind of, because we want to situate things in neat cubby holes, and that just won't get you there. So with students, I often take um, cultural artifacts from the time period, if it's a historical experience, and think about placing that song or that poem in its time period, contextualization. I also like students to talk about their own lives. So I have a class where we talk about music biography and autobiography, but I have them write their own. And in writing their own and thinking critically about the culture that they absorb, they start to see things that they take for granted,
Mm-hmm.
that have lots of lessons about class, lots of lessons about corporate power. So let me just give you an example of something I did in my class, and that's okay. Anybody listening out here, feel free to do the same thing because you're going to get the same result. Now, I'm not a an ornery, cranky old man. I like young people. I like new music. I'm not one of these people who say, y'all ain't making no good music. This stuff y'all listen to is trash. Blah, 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 blah. Because I heard that too. When I was listening to Rick James, my father, who grew up in the sort of the golden age of doo-wop and Motown, he said Rick James couldn't sing. He said, Rick James can't sing. Singing is a temptation. I was like, man, whatever. And I'm sure young people say the same thing to me when I talk about hip hop versus trap, or if I talk about, R&B, when you had artists like Whitney Houston, when you had artists like Tina Marie, that we listen to, right, that could really sing. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear me. You just, no matter what, and you could be right, unless they're young people that have been really influenced by their parents or older generations. It's something like some kind of magnetic force hits their ears. They're not going to hear what you're saying. So what I did was I said, all right, they got this on Spotify, this list of all the top performing hip hop songs called Rap Caviar. It's on Spotify. And that's my go-to list when I want to hear what's, hot.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, look, I'm going to just pick any year. I had the Billboard charts. I said, I'm going to pick 1979, any month, any date, whatever. And we're going to look at the top 10 songs, 1978, 79, somewhere in there. And we're going to look at the top 10 songs on Rap Caviar. I said, I'm willing to bet you there's not one song in the Billboard R&B charts that have anything to do with violence against women, violence against Black people. I'm willing to bet there's none of that. And I'm willing to bet that every single song that we point to in the top Rap Caviar songs has something to do with, folks killing each other, one way or the other. Lo and behold, they went through the lyrics, they're going through it, and they said, wow, I don't even realize I'm dancing to that. I said, oh, wow. Now listen to what you're listening to over here. You're listening to songs, like Let's Groove Tonight by Earth, Wind, and Fire, Celebrating Life. You're listening to songs that talk about love. You're listening to songs that even talk about problems in the community, songs that push for upliftment. And so what happened? And now let's try to solve that problem. What happened? And what is nice about it is the conclusion is not an indictment on a generation. The
Mm-hmm.
conclusion is about the power shift and the monopoly takeover. We go from 3 or 4 huge corporate labels and all their subsidiaries to a bunch of mom and pop labels that are still around in the 1970s, or black music divisions.
Mm-hmm.
That the black experience is filled with as many choices of things to sing and talk about in the present as was the case 40 years ago. We had folks that got into the streets. We had folks that decided not to and took another path. We're not talking about those stories. We're only talking about the stories that corporate media finds titillating and an easy sell. And it's usually the lowest common denominator culturally. Not all the time, but we're about a lot more than sex and killing each other. We have been before and we still are. But the question is, what is being sold? So we talked about that, and that really, I felt, was a important moment in their realizing that as young people and as a black community and as a black people, we have such precious little control over the way that we are represented and also the kinds of things that are being normalized in black culture, more broadly American culture as well. But what we're finding is when we compare the representations of black folks, black women, black men, that it's not so much the presence of, unsavory or problematic images. It's the lack of any real choices. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? And so, because what happens is when you get into these discussions, people say, well, are you talking censorship? Do you want to curtail? That's reality too. And no one's saying that it isn't. But what is not reality is that all of these things about violence, hypersexuality, that's not that's only
Mm-hmm.
a slice of the black experience. So anyway, I'm rambling on, but my point is that that's a lesson that gets that point across. Looking at the charts of different time periods and trying to be less historical in black studies and more nonlinear. Try to read the present into the past and the future into the past. The past into the present, and the future into the past. I do a lot of things like that as well.
That one is a really great lesson, and I'm probably going to use that in my Black culture class in the
Sure,
spring.
sure.
But that also kind of bleeds into this other question that I wanted to ask about, what is most interesting or exciting to you about the past of the field of Black studies, or even like what would you critique about the past of the field of Black studies?
I think I have more to critique about the present because I think that the things that were a part of the Black Studies movement, which was really influenced by the Black Power movement, are issues that we can challenge and expand. So, for instance, there's a heavy masculinist kind of male dominance to social movements in the '60s in general, and the Black Studies is no different from that. And its institutionalization in its early phases captured a lot of that. Over time, we've expanded and been much more inclusive about how we talk about Black life, right? We're talking about different identicalities and spaces within the Black community. We talk about sexuality, we talk about class, we talk about gender, we talk about ableism, we talk about all these different places that have intersections within the Black community and beyond. But what has also happened, Simon, and this is again getting back to the principle of contradiction, Black studies is also hyper professionalized at the same time. All right. So, on one hand, we've opened up and moved beyond narrow conceptions of Blackness, narrow conceptions of family, narrow conceptions of community. We understand that this is much more of a reality that can't be summed up in one particular phrase or one particular concept, that there are contradictions within, there are tensions within. But at the same time, with institutionalization has come professionalism. One thing that was so beautiful about the Black Studies movement is it expanded the idea of what is and who are intellectual contributors and scholars. So
Mhm.
Black Studies movement, you're bringing in Black arts poets, Haki Madhubuti, Sonia Sanchez, teaching at UMass, artists, jazz musicians are teaching courses, not just on jazz. They're teaching Black Studies courses at UMass in particular is one department that was very, very interesting in that regard. So when you think about all of these developments, that's the aspect of Black studies that has sort of fallen off. Now we're becoming much more normative. You've got to get your book out, university press. What about Black presses like Third World Press or the press that did the book I did on James Turner, Diasporic Africa Press? Why is that seen as something that's sort of extra but not the real deal? Because we've given up that movement-centered sensibility that says we bring standards and we are intervening in the academy and changing the norms and confronting them and showing Black excellence and brilliance and genius and all these other dimensions that don't fit into the very narrow pathway that you've constructed. And so that's the part that's being lost. And that's the part that I think the challenge is to capture that spirit of innovation. Now, I find some of that happening on the level of pedagogy and technology. Some of us are, coming up with projects for students to do that's much more in line with their experience. This whole notion of writing a paper, submitting it, getting a grade for it, not caring about it ever again because it
Mhm.
got you the grade. That's becoming less and less, I think, of an incentive to get great student performance. So sometimes we have to, I found having students do a documentary or some other kind of project, now that we're dealing with the online and technologies that allow for this podcast to transpire, we can find activities like that for students. But the question is, how do we as Black Studies scholars and administrators evaluate intellectual and creative work by Black Studies scholars in such a way as to not replicate the narrow and hierarchical view of what constitutes great intellectual work in the academy?
That's a really great question. And one that doesn't, I don't. I think that is a very worthwhile project to consider moving forward in Black Studies, because the academy has very narrow understandings of what constitutes productivity and knowledge, and even in bringing in more different types of knowledge that's not necessarily in a university press book into classrooms, that doesn't necessarily affect how you get your job promotion or how you get that job security, or how your department is ranked in terms of university value. That's a super important question.
Well, that's where I think we are, that's where there's a big challenge.
So that's definitely something we need to work on as a field moving forward. Are there things about where we are now or where we can go that are exciting to you in terms of the future of Black Studies?
Oh, there's so much that's exciting. One is that geographical distance does not present the obstacle that it once did. So if you think about the opportunity we have now to collaborate with institutions all over the Black world, you can have a class with a joint class, with a university in Ghana or Kenya or South Africa. You have study abroad opportunities now. that have been growing. You have so much that's rich about this particular moment. I was able to visit uh, one of the, I guess in English we call them maroon societies, as a Palenque village in Colombia, and that's a group of folks that they ran to the mountains during enslavement, and they have been continuously intact, with obviously change and influence and other things. But what remains of that is still very much present. I was able to visit there and to share that experience with video interviews with students in the States. That, if you can imagine the limitation of not having that technology, so much has changed that has made the world smaller for us in ways where collaboration is much more readily at our fingertips. I remember when, if you just moved out of a city to another city, that was a barrier. Be on the telephone and somebody start talking, you say, "Be quiet, I'm on the phone long distance." "Shh, be quiet, I'm on the phone long distance." Now, if you say that, people think something's wrong with you, because most of the time we're talking long
Yeah.
distance, because distance is no longer even something that we recognize as an obstacle. So those are the things that are very exciting possibilities for collaboration. You can bring you can bring more people into the classroom now without them necessarily being there, but the encounter can still be extraordinarily valuable. So I'm excited about that, and always thinking about new kinds of curricular opportunities with that in mind.
Thank you. That's a really great note um, for that question. The collaborative possibilities, especially given the context within that we now find ourselves living in,
Mhm.
that collaboration is going to be increasingly important. So that being there and then increasing is also a really important point.
Yes, yes, these are definitely some very, very interesting times that I don't know. I try to look to history to figure out what's possible. Certainly, there are a lot of ominous things you can find in history that are still possible today. But I'm also thinking about, the kinds of innovative things from which victory for social justice and positive change were born. And, it's the more I think about it, the more I find that a lot of the successes that we've had have been really just the experimentation, the laboratory of our condition, that people continuously trying to solve problems stumble into. And many of the outcomes folks don't even necessarily foresee.
Mm-hmm.
The Montgomery bus boycott at first was a one-day boycott, and with very, very narrow aims. And it ended up launching, a movement. But if you interviewed the people dealing with it, they were responding to a very local, specific a set of circumstances, and it inspired so much creativity that it was able to grow and become something that others emulated in their own ways. So that's how I think about what's going to happen, and it's unsettling because we all wish we had a blueprint for
Mm-hmm.
getting through this. But the very things that make this a magic moment, as far as the possibilities, also make it a dangerous one. The world being smaller is not just small for those who want social justice. It's also a smaller world for those interested in oppression, hierarchy, dominance, etc. So that's the give and take of the moment.
Yeah. So, on that note, in respects for your time, we'll get in there. But is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything you'd like to say about what you're working on currently or your most recently released music?
Yeah, sure. I did a song called "King of Love" on about Martin Luther King. I'm sort of approaching that song. Like I'm approaching it, thinking about it, inspired by James Weldon Johnson's "Lift Every Voice," and singing that I'd like to have multiple as many versions and as many artists doing it as possible, because the plan for that is, multiple decades. Then I have singles. I do R&B. I have a new song called Mango Drops that I just released in March. I have a song I did with very interesting person, Garfield Bright from the group Shy. Garfield Bright, I met at the NCBS, National Council for Black Studies. I was presenting and I had my bass guitar and I was jamming at a panel discussion. Garfield came up to me. He was in the master's program at the time. And he said, "Man, I didn't know you can do that with a PhD." I said, "You can do whatever you want to do." And he said that was part of what inspired him. He's got a PhD from Georgia State. He's an educationalist. And he's also still singing with Shy. And he sung on a song with me we worked on. It's out called Serenity. And that's another example of just all of the different plots and twists and turns that can come with being in Black Studies. I had no idea. I recognized him as soon as he came up to me afterwards. He's like, "I don't know if you remember me, man. I was in the group." I said, "Bro, I know who you are, man." Next thing you know, we're collaborating on a song. So that's one aspect. And then the book that I'm finishing is one I've been working on for about 20 years, actually. About a couple hundred of interviews in, I think I'm finally wrapping this thing up. It's on the bands of Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, Ohio has the largest per capita number of bands in the late 70s that were signed to major labels in the 70s decade. That were signed to major labels. And so I wanted to get at the culture behind it. Again, this whole prominence and then what's behind it. And the way that community worked together to create outlets for young people that ended up fostering this real network of artists that were successful at getting record deals.
That sounds super interesting. So I'm very much looking forward to when that book comes out. Thank you so much for your time today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of the summer.
You do the same, Professor. Appreciate you.